Muito bem, senhoras e senhores, nós vamos dar início agora ao primeiro painel, que vai abordar o tema Transição na China, Economia. Convidamos para compor o palco os senhores Nicholas Lardy, a Senior Fellow do Peterson Institute for International Economics, e o senhor Luo Xiopeng, consultor dos líderes das reformas de abertura da China. Por favor. E para moderar este painel, temos o prazer de convidar o embaixador Roberto Abdenur, membro do Conselho Curador do Centro Brasileiro de Relações Internacionais.
Nós damos início a esse primeiro painel. Dado o adiantado da hora, temos apenas cerca de 1 hora para os debates. Eu vou solicitar ao senhor Nicholas Lardy e ao senhor Luo Xiopeng que falem por 20 minutos cada um, seguindo-se um período de 20 minutos para perguntas da plateia. Eu dou a palavra agora ao senhor Lardy.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and want to thank the Council for inviting me. I was a participant in the first conference several years ago, and I'm delighted to have a chance to come back and talk again about the macroeconomic situation, which I think will set a framework for much of the discussion that follows. I'm going to try to talk in 20 minutes both about the very short-term outlook and also to give you a medium-term and longer-term look at the Chinese economy and what its growth prospects might be going forward. There's a great deal of controversy now about exactly the state of the Chinese economy. If you look at the official data, you will see that China has now reported economic growth slowing for 7 consecutive quarters, from a peak of about a little over 12% in the first quarter of last year to only 7.4% in the most recently reported data for the third quarter of this year. That's the cautious view. The optimists point to the fact that if you look on a quarter-over-quarter basis, the economy seems to have actually come off the bottom, and that the low point was in the first quarter of this year, and growth has picked up a little bit. But there are lots of qualitative indicators and some quantitative indicators that I think call into question these quarter-over-quarter numbers. In any case, I think even if the economy is somewhat off the bottom, there is a very substantial question as to whether or not the upturn is sustainable. So what I want to talk about first is there is definitely a slowdown, whether you're looking quarter-over-quarter or year-over-year. What are the sources of the slowdown? And there are basically 2. The first is that export growth has slowed quite substantially. You can see in this diagram, China's exports were growing at 30% in 2010, 20% last year, and in the first 3 quarters of this year, exports are up only about 10%. And if you look at the official data coming from the statistical authorities in China, the external sector has actually subtracted about 0.5 percentage point from economic growth in the first 3 quarters of this year. In other words, the external sector has become a drag on China's economic growth rather than a contributor to economic growth. And to a considerable extent, this is a result of a very sharp decline in exports to Europe. Europe, taken as a whole, of course, is China's largest export market. And as you can see here, in the first 3 quarters, this is the data here are on a year-to-date basis. Exports to Europe are not just slowing down, they're shrinking in absolute terms by between 5 and 10% in the first 3 quarters of this year. And with Europe now officially back in recession, I think it's quite unlikely that we're going to see a recovery in Chinese exports to Europe anytime soon. So that's the first factor in the slowdown, a weaker external sector, obviously a function of the global financial crisis and the follow-on crisis in the euro area. A second reason for the slowdown in China is that investment has been slowing, and the major source of that slowing or moderation of investment growth has been the real estate sector. Real estate has become one of the key drivers of China's economic growth over the last 5 years or so. As you can see in this diagram, property investment grew by about 30% a little more than 30% in 2010, a little bit under 30% in 2011. But again, these data for our year to date, you can see that property investment so far this year, overall, that's the black line, is running at about 15%, so roughly half the pace of the previous 2 years. And if you focus in on residential property, which accounts for about 80% of China's property investment, you can see that the pace this year is running at a growth rate of only about 10%. So property investment has slowed substantially over the course of this year. That's the major reason for the slowdown in overall investment growth, which is the second big factor behind China's economic slowdown. Now, the slowdown in property, of course, has dramatic implications for other sectors of the economy. The most obvious is steel. At the peak of the property boom, property was absorbing 40% of China's steel output. Steel output growth is very rapid. As you can see here, though, over the course of the last 3 years, steel production was growing. These are year-over-year data, so it's a little bit difficult to see. But steel production was growing about 15% on average in 2009 and 10. It grew 10% last year. But in the first 3 quarters of this year, steel production in China is only up 2%. So it's a very dramatic change in the steel sector. The steel sector is losing money on a consolidated basis for the first time in many, many years. So to get a really good view on what's going to happen in the Chinese economy going forward, I think you need to look much more closely at the property sector, which has become the biggest single driver of economic growth in China. So I want to spend the next few minutes talking about the property sector, the sources of demand in that sector, and how that's beginning to change. I'm going to skip this slide and come back to it. My view for quite some time has been that the demand for property in China has been very highly elevated, in large part because of financial repression. In this diagram shows you one of the key features of financial repression in China, the real return on a 1-year deposit in the Chinese banking system. As you can see, it averaged in the late 90s up through about the middle of the last decade. It was 3%. And since the beginning of 2004 up to the present time, the average return has been minus about 0.5%. So a very sharp decline in the real interest rate. And keep in mind, this interest rate is not determined by market forces. This interest rate is dictated by the central bank. It tells all the banks the maximum interest rate they can pay on deposits. So this is basically determined by monetary policy run by the central bank. This factor, combined with various controls on capital and a very underdeveloped capital market, both in the equity side and the bond side, has left savers, household savers in China, with very few good opportunities for investment. This has pushed them into housing. Housing has become, I think inadvertently, government policy has made housing a preferred asset class for Chinese households. Your money goes to the bank, it shrinks. If your money goes to the stock market, it's still down 60% from the peak in October 2007, despite the fact that China's economy has done quite well in the years since 2007. Unless you're very well connected or able to circumvent regulations, it's very difficult to move large amounts of money offshore. So people have gone into housing, and that has driven up the share of GDP going into housing investment to really unprecedented levels. The peak in China last year, almost 11% of GDP was going into residential housing. That's way above even the Spanish and US levels, and of course far, far above countries like Taiwan and India, which have never had big housing booms and bubbles. Now, the major source of China moving into the stratosphere in terms of residential property investment is the investment demand for property. More and more households in China are buying property not to live in, but to hold. Call it speculation, if you will. This is a diagram based on a recent survey that shows, on average, urban households own 1.22 residences. That is, 1 out of every 5 urban families has a second house. If you look at the details of this diagram, you can see about 15% of the urban population has 2 houses. About, I can't remember exactly, 5 or 7% have 3 or more houses. If you look closely at the demand for housing back in the boomy period of 2009 and 10, as much as 40% of all the housing being purchased was being purchased for investment or for speculation. So if you want to know the future of the Chinese housing market, you have to think, is this likely to continue? Is it likely that people will continue to view property as a preferred asset class and put a very large share of their savings into residential property and keep residential property as a share of GDP up in the stratosphere as it has been in the last couple of years? Well, from the tone of my question, I'm sure you understand my view is probably the answer to this question is no. And what I want to do is take you through 5 factors that are leading me to the view that maybe we're already seeing a correction and that the slowdown in property investment is because the demand for property as an investment class is beginning to wane. The first piece of information is from a survey done by China Merchants Bank. They survey high net worth individuals, families with more than 10 million RMB in investable assets. One of the questions is, what kinds of asset allocations do you plan on undertaking? And between the survey in 2009 and the survey last year, you can see the red bar here is the decline, a large decline in the planned allocation for property as an investment class. Other classes are going up. Property and bank deposits are going down. A second factor to look at is the indebtedness of the household sector. This diagram shows you there was a very sharp increase in household indebtedness. The black line shows mortgages, the red line shows the total amount of debt. There was a very sharp increase in household indebtedness in the 2009-2010 period. But since that time, mortgage debt has grown less rapidly than disposable income. You can see the black line headed down. We don't have disposable income on a quarterly basis, but mortgage debt has continued to grow very, very slowly in the first 3 quarters of this year. So it looks like household appetite for property is declining. Keep in mind, this diagram shows us that household debt as a share of disposable income in China is extremely high for an emerging market at 50%. You look at Indonesia, Philippines, countries like this, you will see debt levels of 9%, 16%, nothing close to 50%. So the appetite for more debt to buy property seems to be coming down. A third factor to look at is the whole idea of diversification. This is a slide that is giving us a long-term view of what's happened to the composition of household wealth from the late 90s up until roughly the present time. And a couple of things really emerge quite clearly from this. People are getting out of bank deposits. Because of their negative return, the share of bank deposits has fallen by half. Those are the blue segments of the diagrams. And property has more than doubled. It's gone from 18% of total household wealth to about 40% of household wealth. So to keep this boom in property going, you have to be willing to believe that households are going to continue to have a willingness to increase the share of the wealth that they hold in the form of property. And it seems to me at some point households will think they have enough exposure to this asset class and they won't want to add to it at the pace of recent years. A fourth factor is to look at this segment of the Chinese economy from the point of view of financial institutions, the banks that are financing property, either by lending money to property developers or to financing mortgages for individuals. This shows you that bank exposure to property, both in absolute, relative to the total bank lending portfolio and as a share of bank capital, has gone up pretty dramatically. But in the last year and 3 quarters, it has actually begun to come down. In other words, banks are cutting their exposure to property, Part of this is a reflection of government policy, which has encouraged banks to moderate their lending to the property sector, and part of it probably reflects better management of risks by the banks themselves. You can see at the peak, bank exposure to property was equal to 200% of their capital, so a correction in the housing market of any size would have a very adverse effect on bank capital and pose some very fundamental problems for the banking system. Now, I'm going to go back, if I can, to this slide that got out of order. This is the fifth and final factor that I want to look at. The People's Bank of China, the central bank, does a very interesting sentiment survey every quarter, and they ask households a number of questions. And one of the questions they've consistently asked in recent years is, do you expect housing prices to go up, to remain about where they are now, or to go down? And so what I've given you in this diagram is the share of the respondents who think property prices are going to keep going up. And you can see 2-3 years ago, 45–50% of the respondents thought property prices were going to go up. Now we're down to about 20%. This, of course, in my view, is the potential universe of investment buyers. You're not going to buy a third or a fourth or a fifth property if you think the price is going to go down. So the pool of buyers today looks substantially smaller than it did 3 or 4 years ago. So all 5 of these factors that I've gone through suggest to me that we're at the beginning of potentially a substantial long-term correction in the property market, by which I mean that the demand for investment property will moderate. I think there of course will still be an underlying demand based on urbanization, based on upgrading of properties for people that already live in urban areas, but this investment demand, which has been very large, is likely to shrink or grow much more slowly. So that raises if I'm correct, and I'm not certain that I'm correct, but I think it's a significant possibility, I think you have to begin to ask the question, what are the potential offsets? If property investment and investment overall is going to grow at a much more moderate rate than in the recent past, what are the alternative sources of demand that could keep Chinese economy moving ahead at a fairly brisk rate? And the simple answer is, quite frankly, now I've got to jump ahead, get caught up. The simple answer is that household consumption needs to begin to increase much more significantly than it has in the recent past. This is a diagram showing the long-term change in consumption versus investment. Investment as a share of GDP is up in the stratosphere at almost 50% of GDP in the last 3 years, whereas household consumption is very, very low, the lowest of any country in the world at about 34% of GDP. So sustaining growth over time requires the adoption of policies that will encourage more household consumption expenditure to offset the moderation in investment that could come from declining investment demand for housing. Now, the Chinese authorities have talked about this rebalancing for many, many years. They have instituted, as I will show you in a second, some of the policies that would help that. But let me just summarize what I think needs to be done and what one can watch for. And I really divide this into 4 major categories. First, I think there should be a further reduction in foreign exchange market intervention. China has this year intervened substantially less in the foreign exchange market than in previous years. I think the currency is heading more towards an equilibrium value. It's probably still somewhat undervalued, and that has the effect of tilting investment into the manufacturing sector. China has an outsized manufacturing sector and an underdeveloped service sector, and in part that is the result of the undervalued currency that has existed in China for most of the last decade. Let me jump down to the third one. China needs to reform its pricing system, particularly for energy and particularly for electricity. The power generators and the grid companies in China consistently lose money. They have no return on their capital whatsoever, and in most of the last 5 years, they're also losing money on a cash flow basis. This is another significant subsidy to the manufacturing sector. China has a very unusual structure of demand. 75%, fully 75% of all electric power generated in China is consumed in the industrial sector. Well, if a major input like electricity is underpriced, again, it increases profitability in the manufacturing sector, tilts investment into manufacturing and out of services. So the result has been the development of an outsized manufacturing sector and a stunted service sector, and that has been very unfavorable for the growth of employment because the service sector is much more labor intensive. So if China had followed a more balanced growth strategy, they would have had more employment growth, the wage share of national income would have been higher, the profit share going to the corporate sector would have been smaller, and consumption would have been higher. The third element is further financial sector liberalization, particularly the market-oriented interest rate reform that is needed. This, again, has a couple of effects on this consumption-saving imbalance. Low real deposit rates means there's a tax on savers, so their income is less than it would otherwise be. And in China, it also seems to be the case that a lot of people are self-insuring. People are worried about a major medical event. Health coverage has improved, but is still inadequate. So if you have a target amount of money that you want to have in the bank to cover a medical or other contingency, when the real interest rate on your deposit goes down, you can see it's going to take you longer to reach your target level of savings, so you compensate by saving an even larger share of your disposable income. So interest rate reform would have two direct effects to improve consumption. One is it would increase household income, and secondly, it would probably reduce the household saving rate. So those, and finally, build out the social safety net. That's the fourth bullet here. Building out the social safety net would reduce the precautionary demand for savings, lead people to consume a larger share of their income. Keep in mind in China that the best data we have suggests that the household savings rate is about 40% of disposable income. It is in the super stratosphere. No other country has ever come close to saving that large a share of disposable income. So if we're to rebalance and get this consumption share, this red line, to start going up, those are the four policy sets that need to be implemented. There are some others as well, but I think these are the main ones. Those are the ones to watch going forward. They've talked about this. Vested interests have opposed these policy initiatives, and I think the key question for Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang as they come into office is whether or not they have the ability to overcome the vested interests and to move ahead on the rebalancing strategy that has been on the agenda now for more than 5 years. Thank you.
Agradeço muito ao senhor Nicholas Lardy pela magnífica exposição que fez sobre a situação atual da economia chinesa. Passo agora a palavra ao senhor Xiopeng.
Okay, it's a great honor to be here. This is my first visit to South America, so I'm really excited, but I'm also challenged if I can really give my story. So I understand that because I'm living outside China for more than 20 years, that's why back and forth, but I understand the difficulty for cross-cultural dialogue is very difficult, especially for China, to understand the outside world, but more challenging to understand itself. So I'm trying to face that challenge to explain how Chinese understand the self. So the question I intend to answer is, I inspired by a very popular writer on China, is Peter Hastler. In one interview with Chinese, he said something translated: the Chinese people may harm themselves, and American seems easier to harm others. And that's this very deep observation, and the challenge is, why is that? And what would be the implication that Chinese character to itself and to others as China is rising as a global economic power? And another related related is when Chinese hurts its own people, and that China may hurt the people in other parts of the world as well. So that's my intention. And there is a deep historical roots of Chinese character, of course, and I try to understand that. And I give some simple answers. You know, there is historically the strengths and the weakness of Chinese empire. Of course, there is a high social mobility through meritocracy in China. So the competition between individuals and families very strong because of that high social mobility in China. And we have very large self-governed rural society and a strong kinship bond and hard work ethic, as well known to the world. And what is the last one is here, I say. Yeah, and there is very broadly spread economic freedom and the prosperity, although it's not always stable. There's a cycle, dynasty cycle in it. Of course, there's a weakness for Chinese character, and what I understand is very limited, or someone says no public space, so it's very not active politically, and lack of public so-called spiritedness, and particularly lack of public reasoning. So it's not very sensitive to injustice, a very weak legal system, and there's dualism in the face between the elite and the masses, and it's not very united society. So using the perspective from so-called social biology, and I would characterize China is more dominated by individual selection. So the competition across families, individuals, very strong, but the competition between groups, especially, so it's weak. And that weakness is somehow made up by the revolution. So the key point I like to make is there is a strong legacy left by the Communist Revolution, as Communist Revolution had implanted some key elements to China. So which is egalitarianism and collectivism. That really changed the identity games in China. And what I might make the argument is China, because the Cultural Revolution, because the Communist Revolution, China became, the state of China built up the capacity to manipulate collectivity. We have some major social experiments like Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and I include the Deng's economic reform. All those very radical social experiments is based on the new capacity of state to manipulate the society and to manipulate the regional governance. And that's the key argument I'd like to make. This state capacity been embodied in a very unique collective rights system, which Chinese scholars characterize China's society after the revolution as they call the unit society. So everybody attached to a collective unit, and your rights, your social and economic rights, is defined by the rank and the status of that collective unit. With this new social system and the communist ideology, the society being completely transformed. It's very different from the past traditional Soviet society. And the Chinese people made huge sacrifice, and to build a socialist nation state. And the game of identity in China before the reform, I try to characterize it. There's a social hierarchy that was strictly structured through the hierarchy of collective units. So you tell me which ranks, what kind of collective units you tied, so I can tell what kind of your rights would have. And the economic resources and the social wealth were distributed according to the ranks of your unit. So was the economic rent generated from the economic system. So in this very hierarchical society, about 800 million of peasants, they were at the bottom. So the rise of Chinese economy as a global power is based on this social system. That's the relevance of this point. So the reform actually have some new rules, so to liberalize the energy, to release energy. It started from decollectivization and also decentralization of the physical system. So I skip this. I just give you the, yes. Basically, the idea is to allow the collective units, including the local government, to buy their freedom with money. So the central government is very limited by the physical capacity. So if you can come up with something to support yourself, I would give you a try. So that's a simple logic for the change in the early stage of the reforms. So money can buy freedom, and that's generate unexpected result. As China decollectivizes agriculture, so people believe before that, the shortage of food would be the primary constraint for China's economic growth. Actually, in the 3 years of decollectivization, China has come up with surplus of grain supply. However, there are questions raised by the early years of reform. Because this rule didn't respond to the question, of fairness. So you can buy freedom with money, and how it relates to the hierarchy before. For instance, the Chinese reform started from the bottom. So the bottom can buy freedom, and then they become richer than the urban people. So that challenged the hierarchy before. So what would be the rules for the new game? And that, in my understanding, was the reason behind the political problems we encountered in 1989. And after that political crisis, and we had a kind of a new rules, which is not fair, but it worked. The new rule for the game is power can be translated into money, and the money can buy power. And that also worked for a while because the central government re-centralized some of their mechanism to strengthen the central. So there was a secret deal between central government and the local government in 1993. which is not really well known by even experts in China, on China. The central government, the basic message is to force local government to pay certain percentage of growth in revenue to central government, and no, is without any condition. So you have to increase the revenue to the central government by 18%, even more, on annual basis. And I don't care if you can do it. And that forced the regional government reach to the bottom, and that means you have to lower the environment standard, lower the labor rights, because otherwise you will lose in this economic competition. And to give you a two story to support my argument, one is, the Chinese labor story. You may already know, but may not know, the central question is why China's labor is so cheap. We have about more than 200 million labor now every year have to move in China and to leave their village, home village, and working with some cities, but the place you work is not your hometown. And next year you may end up in another town, right? So we have more than 200 million population actually they're not homeless, but they are hometownless. And they left more than 50 million children behind in their home back in village. The kids with their grandparents or in the a lodged school like that. The simple calculation, people ask why they accept such a low wage, especially in the early 90s and up to the early years of century. If you have a small plot of land which is sufficient for the consumption for family size of 4, if one labor go out, that means the other 3 can gain more consumption because one is out. He doesn't need or she doesn't need to consume. So that you can accept very low wage where your family actually better off for your off. So that's the starting. So the argument here is the wage levels could be below the basic needs of family because of the system. And another story, very relevant to the interest here in Brazil, is what the mechanism behind the crazy iron ore market in China. And the capacity of crude steel production in China, by some estimate, is over 1 billion metric tons, which is, everybody admitted that is way above its needs. But why is that? So what is a mechanism behind that overcapacity? And that yes, there is a demand factor as laid out by Professor Lardy. There's huge demand. Also, there is system logic behind that, which is actually the steel capacity established a game of rent seeking in the iron ore market. The steel mill, steel producer, not necessarily to purchase, yes, I will finish, the iron ore at the lowest price. Actually is very much related how much the kickback. You understand? The people who get the deal not necessarily give the best quality and the best price, but we give the best kickback. So to play that game, you have to have the capacity of steel production, and you have to get into that business. So that really drives the local government crazy to build up. Of course, there are also other, but this rent-seeking game also is part of crazy the market of Northern Korea. Maybe I can put, and this is so I mean, to conclude my presentation, the challenges by rise of Chinese as a global economic power is that when China itself is not balanced, the world cannot be balanced. When China hurt its own people, China actually hurts many people in other parts of the world. When China sides with socialism, socialism fell. And would China, that the capitalism fail because China is siding with the capital in its own way at this time? And that's the question would be answered, and maybe in the next decade. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, professor Lo, por a sua interessante e até instigante exposição no final. Nós vamos ter pouco tempo para as perguntas, apenas cerca de 20 minutos. Eu vou me valer do privilégio de ser moderador para fazer uma única pergunta, e eu a dirijo ao professor Lardy. Lendo um de seus trabalhos na internet, professor, eu vejo que o senhor alinha 3 hipóteses para o futuro crescimento da economia chinesa. Uma hipótese otimista, com crescimento em torno de 8%, sustentadamente. Uma hipótese pessimista, com crescimento baixando a cerca de 5%, e uma hipótese intermediária. Esta é uma pergunta que tem muita relevância, eu creio, para toda a economia internacional e muito particularmente para o Brasil, dada uma certa dependência que o Brasil tem hoje da demanda chinesa por seus produtos. O senhor poderia dizer-nos brevemente qual o cenário que o senhor considera mais provável?
Yes. The bullish scenario is based on the assumption that the government is very aggressive in pushing ahead with policies of the type I outlined that would promote increased private consumption expenditures. So investment growth slows down moderately over time, consumption growth picks up, and the structure of the economy changes over a 7, 8, 9, 10-year period, and you have quite strong economic growth, about 8%, and you get at the end of the period to an investment share that's about 40% of GDP as compared to the roughly 50% of today. The more negative scenario, the very negative scenario, is one in which investment is cut quite sharply, and in that environment, consumption also tends to be relatively weak, and that leads to the 5% growth. That's the most adverse scenario. And then there's an intermediate scenario. And I think there are a couple of takeaways from doing this kind of scenario analysis. First of all, rebalancing the growth, rebalancing China's economy, I think will be a decade-long process. It took them a decade to get to the relatively imbalanced growth structure we have today, and I think it will take a decade to rebalance. If you try to rebalance too quickly, then I think the risk is growth slows down quite a bit to roughly the 5% range. So again, as I said in my remarks, I think the thing to watch going forward is how aggressive are the policies to promote private consumption. I should close on a positive note, and that is if you look at the last 2 years, the growth of private consumption expenditure in the last 2 years is well above the 10-year average. Private consumption expenditure in China actually grew by 11% last year. And obviously the corollary is over the last 2 years, investment growth has been below the 10-year average. So I think some people have this idea that somehow you can't get consumption to grow any more rapidly than it has been. But I think the last 2 years disproves that consumption growth has been quite rapid. And I think with further policy initiatives, the government can keep consumption growth up at a fairly strong level, 9 to 10%, and that will lead to the bullish scenario. So I'm hoping for the bullish scenario for China. It will mean the structure of demand will be quite different because investment will come down from about 50% to 40%. The growth of steel output will be much slower. Investment in housing will be about 7% of GDP instead of 11% of GDP that we have this year.
Muito obrigado, professor. Eu abro agora a sessão a perguntas. Queria solicitar a quem deseja fazer perguntas que as façam de maneira muito direta e objetiva, sem estender-se em comentários, dado o adiantado da hora, justamente. Existem atendentes que levarão os microfones a quem desejar fazer perguntas. Por favor, está aberta a sessão. E eu peço que quem desejar fazer perguntas as dirija a um dos dois palestrantes. Temos uma pergunta do lado de lá.
Yes, Mr. Lardy, in English. You mentioned the survey of high net worth individuals in one of your slides. Now, in the next slide, it was non-specific in terms of the first survey about property ownership increasing and people spending more money on property. The second one, you used a broader segment. So how many Chinas are we talking about here? I mean, they're the rich people that you're trying to promote with the survey, and then there's a second and third China as it falls back. So how do you split the difference on that?
Well, I wanted to look at least initially at high net worth individuals because these are a significant part of the property investment. These are the very rich merchants from Wenzhou who are buying up 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 properties. They're putting a very large share of their wealth into real estate. But this is only the top 1% of the income distribution. But the other diagrams are based on the whole population. So, for example, the 1.22 figure, that is 1 out of 5 urban households has a second property. So it's not just the top 1% going heavily into property investment. It's a much, much broader segment of the population. If that means the top 20% in terms of income have a second house. And the same thing is true with the diagram on the composition of household wealth. That's for the entire urban population and showing that the share of wealth that is held in the form of real estate has more than doubled from the late 90s up to 2010. So I think it's a very pervasive phenomenon, but it's probably even more pronounced among the richest households in China.
Alguma outra pergunta, por favor? Nenhuma outra pergunta? Sim, temos uma aqui do embaixador Sérgio Amaral.
Obrigado. Eu queria, em primeiro lugar, cumprimentar os dois apresentadores por palestras que tocam dois aspectos do quadro econômico, mas eu tenho uma dúvida maior no que diz respeito à apresentação do professor Lardy, que eu acho que é uma apresentação fundamental para nós pensarmos as perspectivas econômicas da China e, por consequência, vamos dizer, as relações, o seu impacto sobre as relações Brasil-China. Sua análise centra em dois fatores, basicamente, para a redução da taxa de crescimento, e mais do que uma redução ocasional, eu diria, é uma redução no patamar de crescimento, de um nível de 10% para um nível de 7% a 8%. Isso faz parte, de certa forma, está implícito no 12º plano econômico da China, plano quinquenal. E, de certa forma, também era um objetivo estabelecido pelo governo chinês nas suas metas para a economia. É certo que os dois fatores que apontou, que são a demanda por produtos chineses por parte da economia mundial, particularmente pela Europa, eu diria também pelos Estados Unidos, teve um papel muito importante, e o mercado imobiliário, a queda do mercado imobiliário também. Eu acho que nós podemos talvez acrescentar o fato de que a China investiu muito em infraestrutura e depois, praticamente, esses investimentos se tornaram menos necessários, mas eu acho que nisso tudo tem também, fora a questão das exportações, tem uma política deliberada anti-inflacionária, por exemplo, que levou a uma redução, uma contenção na política financeira, nos empréstimos e mesmo na política de estímulo fiscal que vinha sendo praticada. A pergunta é a seguinte: esses fatores, eles têm sustentabilidade? Quer dizer, o governo chinês vai continuar querendo desaquecer a economia ou, ao contrário, como as últimas medidas indicam, poderia estar já buscando o reaquecimento da economia? Será que nós podemos imaginar que a demanda mundial por exportações chinesas vai continuar tão baixa quanto esteve nesse ano? Quer dizer, será que nós estamos num processo, e essa em resumo é a pergunta, num processo de redução do crescimento que poderá continuar, ou numa queda de patamar que poderá se estabilizar no ponto em que a taxa de crescimento se encontra hoje?
Well, I think your question is a very good one. I think it does point out that the government seems to have come to the view that the sustainable level of economic growth is something in the 7 or 7.5%, 8% range, rather than the average of 10% that we have witnessed over more than 3 decades. And I think that's a very positive development. I think a slightly lower rate of growth is more sustainable, and I don't think we're going to see the resumption of a very aggressive stimulus program as we saw in 2009 and to some extent in 2010. I think that very aggressive policy was warranted in view of the very sharp global economic slowdown, and I think China's leadership did extremely well to keep growth up. But today, I think there's a recognition that China's situation is different. Government debt is much higher today than it was in 2008. The way I put it on infrastructure is, and it's consistent with what you said, in 2009 and 2010, China built 5 years worth of infrastructure in 2 years. And it was a very good way of keeping up the growth rate. I think it will contribute to long-term economic growth, but as your comment suggested, you can't build 5 years worth of infrastructure every 2 years. So we're seeing some modest increase in infrastructure investment in the second half of this year, but it's very subdued. So I think that's a very sound policy. So I hope the government will stick to the 7.5% growth rate or 7%, whatever's in the 12 5-year plan. I think that will allow China to keep inflation under control. Remember, inflation, as measured by the CPI, did go to 5.4% last year, which is well above the long-term average for China. So I think they'll have better results on inflation, more efficiency of investment if the investment rate moderates, and they aim for a growth rate in the neighborhood of 7 to 8%.
Muito obrigado. Temos uma outra pergunta aqui do professor Renato Flores, da Fundação Getúlio Vargas.
Eu teria uma pergunta ao senhor Xiopeng. Eu achei muito interessante a sua apresentação com a evolução
Está faltando a tradução. Está bem? Sim, agora sim. Para o inglês, né?
Tá. Eu achei muito interessante a sua apresentação com a evolução dos modos de liderança e governança na China, do Império, período comunista e o período das reformas. Mas a minha pergunta é dupla. É que, embora tenha havido uma maior consciência da coletividade e uma tremenda mudança dos meios de produção, com um poder maior do dinheiro, do money, como o senhor falou, será que, no fundo, a estrutura de governança não permaneceu a mesma do Império, com um sistema altamente centralizado, uma forma de administração pelo mandarinato e um controle grande do país? Então, essa é a minha primeira pergunta. Atrás das mudanças que o senhor colocou, talvez exista uma uniformidade maior. E a segunda pergunta é que, talvez, se o senhor concordar com a minha primeira observação, essa seja a forma viável de governo de uma China unida, dado o tamanho do país e a diversidade da sua população.
Oh, okay. This is a central question for China's future, and really in the minds of so many people, both inside and outside China. I believe we should have a great chance to create a new kind of governance in China by developing the region-to-region relationship. So I would characterize a kind of I said the reciprocal localism. And I think this is growing, and this is not only the formula for China's future. I believe is also the formula for the future world. Is in the new globalized economy is critical to develop a kind of mutual beneficial relationship between different regions, rather than really is the nation-state relationship. That's the conceptual answer. I think that possibility is real and is growing in China.
Quero agradecer ao professor Lardy e ao professor Luo. Foram excelentes as palestras e dessa maneira encerramos esta sessão.